You wake up 30,000 years ago, and the first thing you notice isn't the cold, it's your hip. It's been stiff since the hunt went wrong. Winter's ago, and it still complains every morning. Your teeth are flat and worn, ground down by years of meat mixed with grit and stone dust. Somewhere outside, a child is crying, and you know that cry. You helped raise him. You've watched 3 generations take their first steps in this camp. You are an elder here. Your age is 47. Stop for a second. Doesn't that sound wrong? You've probably heard the opposite your whole life. That prehistoric people were old by 25. That making it to 30 was rare. Almost a miracle. That gray hair simply didn't happen back then. It's in the documentaries. It's in the textbooks. It's the kind of fact people repeat without ever questioning it. And it does come from a real number. That's what makes it so convincing. But that number has been badly misread. And once you understand why, it doesn't just correct a fact about the past. It changes how you see the entire story of our species. So here's the real question. Did ancient humans actually die before 30? Because the closer you look at that statistic, the less it says what everyone assumes it says. Here's what's true. For most of human history, average life expectancy really did sit somewhere between 25 and 35 years. Demographers aren't wrong about that. But averages hide details. And this one hides something huge. It comes down to 2 words almost nobody mentions when they repeat this fact. At birth. That phrase changes everything. And understanding it means understanding how a single misread statistic convinced generations of people that our ancestors barely got the chance to grow old. Before we get into it, if stories like this, about how we became human, catch your attention, hit subscribe. There's a lot more history hiding in plain sight. So what does at birth actually mean? It means that number isn't measuring how long adults lived. It's measuring the average across every single birth, including the ones that ended almost immediately. Here's the mechanism. In the ancient world, infant and childhood mortality was brutal. Disease, exposure, accidents, complications at birth itself. A huge percentage of children never made it past their 5th birthday. And when you calculate an average, every single one of those short lives gets folded into the same equation as the people who live to be old. The math doesn't distinguish between a life that ended at 2 and a life that ended at 70. It just adds them together and divides. That's where the distortion comes from. Not from adults dying young. From children dying in huge numbers and dragging the average down with them. Picture it this way. Line up 10 people from an ancient community, side by side, based on how long each of them lived. 4 of them, tragically, don't make it past age 5. The other 6 live full lives, reaching into their 70s. Now do the math on all 10. The average comes out to somewhere around 40. But look at that lineup again. Not one of those 10 people actually died at 40. 4 died as small children. 6 lived to be old. The average describes a moment nobody in that group ever experienced. That's the trap. On average can be mathematically accurate and still describe something that never happened to a single real person. It's a number built from 2 very different groups smashed together. The very young and the very old, with almost nobody actually landing in the middle. This isn't unique to prehistoric humans. By the way, it's just how statistics work. And it's worth remembering the next time a headline throws a single average number at you as if it tells the whole story. Averages are useful, but they can also flatten reality into something misleading if you don't ask what's hiding underneath them. So once you strip away the infant mortality that's dragging that number down, a much more interesting question appears. Forget the average. Forget the statistic that includes children who never got the chance to grow up. Ask this instead. If a person in the ancient world survived those dangerous early years, made it past childhood, past the illnesses and accidents that claimed so many others, how long could they actually expect to live? That's a completely different question, and the answer isn't 30. To answer that question, scientists couldn't just guess. They needed real populations to study, and since we can't interview anyone from 37 years ago, researchers turned to the closest living comparison we have. Hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today. Groups whose way of life, no agriculture, no modern medicine, no permanent settlements, closely mirrors how our ancestors actually lived. In 2007, 2 researchers, Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan, published a major study in the journal Population and Development Review. They compiled decades of demographic data from several hunter-gatherer and forager populations around the world. The Hadza of Tanzania, the Ache of Paraguay, the Hiwi of Venezuela, and the Kung of Southern Africa. These aren't people living in isolation from history. They're communities whose daily survival, hunting, gathering, moving with the seasons, facing disease without antibiotics, gives researchers a working model of the pressures our ancestors likely faced. The findings were striking. Yes, childhood mortality in these groups was high, just as researchers expected, and just as it likely was in the deep past. But for the people who survived childhood, who made it to around age 15, the picture changed dramatically. Average life expectancy for that group jumped to somewhere between 68 and 78 years old. Read that again. Not 30, not 40, up to nearly 80 for people living without hospitals, without vaccines, without any of the medical infrastructure we rely on today. This is exactly the pattern predicted by the at-birth problem. Once you remove the enormous weight of childhood deaths from the equation, the real ceiling on human lifespan looks a lot closer to what we see today than most people assume. Our bodies were, and are, built to last for decades past childhood. The danger was never aging itself. It was getting through the first few fragile years. And this isn't just a modern statistical model built on assumption. The skeletal record backs it up. When archaeologists examine ancient remains, they're not just looking at bones. They're reading a biography written in calcium. Teeth show decades of wear from grinding tough, fibrous food. Joints show the kind of arthritis that only develops after many years of repeated use. Bone density and healed fractures tell stories of injuries survived, not just injuries suffered. Across multiple prehistoric sites, researchers keep finding the same pattern. Individuals whose skeletons show clear signs of having lived well into what we'd now call middle age or beyond. Now, it's worth being careful here. Modern hunter-gatherer societies aren't a perfect time machine. They live in different environments, face different diseases, and have had, in some cases, occasional contact with modern medicine or trade. Researchers use them as the best available reference point, not as an exact replica of Ice Age life. But when demographic modeling and skeletal evidence point in the same direction, independently, that convergence is hard to dismiss. Two very different kinds of evidence, one from living populations, one from ancient bones, are telling a consistent story. And that story is this: dying young wasn't the rule for adults. It was the risk that came before adulthood. Once someone crossed that threshold, their odds of a long life were far better than the 30-year-old ancestor myth would have you believe, which raises a much harder question than the one we started with. If people really were living into their 60s, 70s, even beyond, in a world without agriculture, without stored food surplus, without any guarantee of safety, how did a community afford to keep someone alive who could no longer hunt, no longer gather, no longer contribute in the ways survival seemed to demand? In a world where every calorie had to be earned, where a failed hunt could mean days without food, keeping someone alive who couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, couldn't even chew solid meat seems like it should have been impossible. Logic says a group under that kind of pressure abandons anyone who becomes a burden, and yet the archaeological record says the opposite happened, again and again. One of the clearest examples comes from a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar. In the 1950s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who lived roughly 47 years ago. Researchers now refer to him as Shanidar I, though he's better known by a more human nickname, the Old Man of Shanidar. And old is relative here. Bone wear suggests he was somewhere around 40 to 50 years old when he died, which for a Neanderthal navigating an Ice Age landscape was a remarkably long life. His skeleton tells a hard story. One arm had been amputated or had withered away, likely from an injury early in life. I was blind, or nearly blind, in one eye, based on damage near the skull. His bones show signs of significant arthritis, the kind that would have made walking, let alone hunting, difficult or impossible. By any practical measure, this man should not have survived. He couldn't track prey with full vision. He couldn't grip a spear with one working arm. He couldn't outrun danger on joints that ached with every step. But he didn't just survive for a few extra weeks. The evidence suggests he lived for years after those injuries occurred. Years of being fed, years of being protected, years of a group choosing, deliberately, to carry the weight of someone who could no longer carry his own. Now, researchers are careful about how far to take this. We can't know the exact emotional motivations of a Neanderthal community 47 years ago. What the bones tell us is that survival happened, not why it happened. But survival at that level of disability, in that environment, is extremely difficult to explain without some form of sustained group care. A second case comes from Demency in the country of Georgia, where archaeologists found a skull, often called Skull 5, dating back an almost unbelievable 8 million years, tied to some of the earliest hominins to leave Africa. This individual had lost nearly all of their teeth, and the jawbone shows the sockets had healed over, meaning the tooth loss happened long before death. Chewing raw meat or tough plants with no teeth left would have been nearly impossible without help. Some researchers, including paleoanthropologist David Lord Kipanidze, who led the excavation, have suggested this points to a form of food processing or direct assistance from others in the group. Pounding food. softening it, sharing it in a form this person could actually eat. It's a compelling interpretation, though not the only one. Other researchers note that some soft foods might have been manageable without direct help. Either way, this individual lived long enough, after losing their teeth, for the bone to fully remodel, which itself takes real time. What both cases points to is something bigger than individual survival stories. An elder who could no longer hunt wasn't just a person to feed. They were memory. They were the one who remembered where water could be found during a drought that happened decades ago, which plants healed a wound and which ones could kill, which paths animals took in a bad winter. Losing that person didn't just mean one less mouth to worry about feeding. It meant losing information nowhere else existed. In a world with no writing, no books, no way to look anything up. A person's memory was the only library a community had. That idea, that older people functioned as living libraries, isn't just a nice metaphor. It might actually explain one of the strangest features of human biology, one that barely exists anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Think about menopause for a moment. In evolutionary terms, it's bizarre. From a purely reproductive standpoint, natural selection should favor individuals who keep reproducing for as long as they physically can. That's how genes get passed on. And yet human females, uniquely among almost all mammals, stop being able to reproduce years, sometimes decades, before their lives actually end. Most animals that stop reproducing simply die shortly after. Humans don't. So why would evolution build in a long stretch of life after reproduction stops? Wouldn't those extra years, from a pure gene passing perspective, be wasted? In the late 1990s, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes proposed an answer while studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania. She noticed something specific. Grandmothers in Hadza communities weren't sitting on the sidelines. They were actively gathering food, especially hard to extract but calorie-rich foods like tubers, and feeding their grandchildren with it. This support measurably improved the survival odds of those grandchildren, freeing up the children's mothers to have more offspring sooner, since they had less pressure to provide every calorie themselves. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis. The core idea is that a woman's genes could spread more effectively, not by her personally having more children later in life, but by keeping her own daughter's children alive and well-fed. In that light, menopause isn't a biological glitch. It's a shift in strategy, from direct reproduction to supporting the survival of the generation that came after. It's important to say clearly, this is a hypothesis, not a settled law of nature. It's one of several ideas anthropologists have proposed to explain why humans live so long past their reproductive years. There are competing explanations, and researchers continue to debate which factors mattered most and how they interacted. But the grandmother hypothesis is widely respected because it connects two things we can actually observe: real support from older women in surviving hunter-gatherer societies, and the genuine survival benefit that support provides to the next generation. If something similar held true deep in our evolutionary past, then a long post-reproductive life wouldn't be an accident. It would be exactly what natural selection was quietly building towards. Now, none of this means ancient life was safe. It would be just as misleading to swing from everyone died at 30 to growing old was easy. It wasn't. Childbirth carried enormous risk, both for mothers and infants, without modern medical intervention to fall back on. A minor infection that antibiotics would clear up in days could become fatal within weeks. Predators were a constant, real threat, not a dramatic exaggeration. Conflict between groups over territory or resources could end a life at any age, regardless of skill or strength. 30 wasn't a wall nobody crossed. It was more like a genuinely dangerous stretch of road. The odds were worse than we'd accept today. But plenty of people made it through and kept going for decades afterward. And this connects to something people often get wrong about evolution altogether. There's a popular phrase, survival of the fittest, that gets thrown around as if it only means the strongest, fastest, or most physically dominant individual wins and everyone else is left behind. But that's a distorted version of what the science actually shows. Fitness, in evolutionary terms, isn't about individual dominance. It's about what helps genes, and the group carrying them, persist across generations. A community that protected its injured, fed its elderly, and preserved its accumulated knowledge wasn't acting against survival instincts. It was practicing one of the most effective survival strategies our species ever developed. Cooperation wasn't the opposite of fitness. In humans, it may have been one of the biggest drivers of it. if long life among our prehistoric ancestors still feels hard to picture, since so much of that evidence comes from bones and statistical models rather than written records. The historical record fills in the picture with far less ambiguity, and it points in exactly the same direction. Jump forward from the Ice Age to ancient Greece, and the pattern of long life doesn't fade. It actually becomes easier to document. Because now, for the first time, we have names, dates, and written testimony instead of just skeletal wear. Socrates was around 70 years old when he was sentenced to death in 399 BCE, spending decades teaching and debating in Athens before that famous trial ever happened. Plato, his student, lived to roughly 80, continuing to write and run his academy well into old age. Sophocles, the playwright behind some of the most famous tragedies in Western literature, reportedly lived into his 90s, still producing acclaimed work in his final years. These weren't isolated miracles. They were prominent enough and common enough that Greek society had already built entire institutions around the presence of the old. Look at the word Senate. It comes from the Latin senex, meaning old man. Rome's Senate wasn't a symbolic name. It reflected an actual expectation that governing bodies should be shaped by people who had accumulated decades of experience. You don't build a political system around advanced age as a value if reaching that age is rare or unusual. I'll build it because there were enough people living long enough, staying sharp enough, and being respected enough for that structure to make sense. This matters because it closes a gap in the story. Skeletal evidence and modern hunter-gatherer studies suggest long life was possible deep in prehistory. Written history confirms that this wasn't some slow trend that only started once civilization appeared. By the time we reached societies that could write things down, long life wasn't a new development being reported for the first time. It was already an established, unremarkable part of being human, one that supported entire systems of governance, philosophy, and cultural memory. The thread runs continuously, from a Neanderthal cared for in a cave in Iraq, to a philosopher teaching in an Athenian courtyard well into his old age. Go back to that morning, 3,000 years ago, the elder waking up with a stiff hip and worn-down teeth, the child crying outside. A child that elder helped raise, that person wasn't an exception. They weren't some rare case archaeologists got lucky enough to find. They were a normal, expected part of how ancient communities worked. Proof that a long life wasn't the myth. The myth was the number 30. That number was never a wall people rarely crossed. It was a statistic quietly built from the deaths of children who never got the chance to grow old, folded into the same average as the adults who lived on for decades after them. Once you pull those two groups apart, the real story comes into focus. Most people who survived childhood went on to live full, long lives, often reaching 60, 70, sometimes beyond, cared for by communities that understood something we're still relearning today. A person's value doesn't disappear when their body slows down. The elder in that camp wasn't being kept alive out of pity. They were kept alive because they held something nothing else could replace. Memory, experience, knowledge passed down with no other way to survive except through a living person willing to share it. That's not a footnote in our evolutionary story. It might be one of the reasons our species made it this far at all. So the next time you hear someone repeat that old myth about ancient humans dying at 30, you'll know the real story behind that number. If this kind of history, the kind that gets misunderstood generation after generation, is something you want more of, subscribe and stay for what's coming next.